On July 27, 1981, in Birmingham, UK, Nova Welsh stopped answering her phone. The 24-year-old mother of two had recently separated from her husband, Osmond Bell, and it was very unlike her to disappear. The day of her disappearance, she had dropped off her children with her ex-husband and went out dancing with her new boyfriend, Wayne Newby, and a group of friends. A neighbor said that she had returned that evening but appeared upset. Neighbors interviewed in the following days of her disappearance noted that they had heard crying and fighting coming from Nova's apartment. This, unfortunately, was a regular occurrence as her ex-husband had been known to be violent and abusive to Nova throughout their relationship. Nova's parents and siblings had just immigrated to Miami, Florida, and her mother, Lorna, became increasingly distressed that she couldn't get a hold of her daughter. They had hoped that Nova would bring her children and join them in the U.S. Nova and her family were very close. The family had immigrated to the UK from Jamaica in 1957. At 16, Nova got into a relationship with Osmond Bell and moved out to live with him when she became pregnant with her first child. She had recently escaped their relationship, kicking her abusive spouse out of their home, and she was rebuilding her life without him. They had only been separated for a few weeks when she disappeared. Bell was interviewed before the discovery of her body. He hadn't reported her missing, claiming to officers that he just assumed she had run away with her new boyfriend or visited her family in the U.S. Without evidence, police were forced to release Bell. On August 18, 1981, there was a discovery made in the building Nova lived in. Residents began reporting a terrible smell coming from somewhere in the building. Officers were dispatched, and in a utility closet, they discovered Nova's body, covered in a blanket and newspapers. Bell was arrested and held for 4 days while they did their initial investigation. Her autopsy showed that her cause of death had been a broken neck. Police had received a letter from a witness claiming that they had seen Welsh fighting with a man who clearly wasn't Osmond in her kitchen. Police asked if Bell knew anything about the author of the letter, to which he denied. Without any further evidence to connect Bell to the slaying, they were forced to release him. After that, the case went cold. In 2016, cold case detectives were going through old cases. Now that DNA evidence had advanced significantly since the 80s, the investigators were particularly hopeful in Nova Welsh's case. Her file contained a piece of gum that was used to secure the cupboard door closed that she had been found in, as well as potential DNA on the letter that had been mailed to police. They found that the DNA on the letter and the DNA on the chewing gum matched. Following that, they got a court order to secure DNA from Osmond Bell, and from there, they compared the DNA. He was then arrested and had a trial a year later. The courts determined that the murder had not been premeditated and had been a result of Bell flying into a fit of rage when he discovered that Nova had been out with a new man. It was determined that he had written the letter and mailed it to police to divert attention off of him. He was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 12 years in prison. The now 60-year-old had been living as a free man for 34 years. Nova's mother, Lorna, said in her victim impact statement at the trial that Nova was gentle, loving, and full of life, and that the unfortunate and tragic loss of her life prevented her from seeing her children grow up as young adults. It was a late evening on December 14, 1995, when 17-year-old Tracy Beslanowitch told her boyfriend that she would go get something to eat. The two were living out of a North Temple motel in Salt Lake City, Utah. She told him she was going to the Circle K gas station, a short walk from the motel. By around midnight, her boyfriend Chris began to worry, as it was unlike Tracy to not come home. He went out to look for her, knocking on neighbors' doors and going down to the Circle K. However, he failed to report her missing. The following morning, 45 miles from Salt Lake City, at the Provo River, a man was hunting with his son when they came across a body. The woman was naked and had been brutally murdered. Several granite rocks around her body were covered in blood. The police started their investigation at the crime scene. There they took several rocks around her body as evidence. As her cause of death was blunt force trauma, they felt it was likely that one of the stones had been the murder weapon. They also found a pair of socks neatly folded on a rock near the body. Since the woman had no identification, they decided to appeal to the media and publish photos of her tattoos. She had 2 distinct tattoos which police were hopeful someone would recognize. Meanwhile, Chris was still not able to locate Tracy. He had started combing through the news. It wasn't like Tracy to not return. He was fearful that something terrible had happened. His heart sank when a news segment began discussing a murdered Jane Doe and had displayed familiar tattoos. He contacted police to tell them that he knew who the Jane Doe was. Chris gave the police the only contact number he had for Tracy's family. Police called and made contact with Tracy's stepfather, who was devastated. They were only a few minutes into the conversation before a realization was made. The body they discovered was likely his younger stepdaughter, Krystal, not his daughter, Tracy. Krystal had a history of using her older half-sister's identity. Her stepfather told police that Krystal had dropped out of high school and was working as a prostitute. She had started getting mixed up in drugs at 15, and though her parents tried to get her help, she didn't want to make any changes to her lifestyle. Chris was brought in as a suspect. They felt that Chris had purposely lied about Krystal's identity, and they also felt it was suspicious that he hadn't reported her missing, and he also hadn't been honest about where she'd been that night. Krystal hadn't gone out for food that night. She went to work, and the police were back to square one, having no idea where to start their search. Chris was released as there was no evidence to link him to the murder. Police also determined that he had no motive. He had lied to protect Krystal, as she was underage, and he didn't tell officers she was a prostitute because he'd wanted the police to not treat her like she didn't deserve justice because of what she did for a living. Chris was also financially dependent on Krystal, and he didn't have a vehicle, so he alone couldn't have driven her the 45 miles away from Salt Lake City, where she had been found. Police turned their attention to another suspect, a local cab driver that had an unhealthy obsession with Krystal. However, this lead met a dead end when he was able to be eliminated forensically. As far as leads went, that was all they had. There was foreign male DNA found on a rock that was likely used to bludgeon Krystal, but there was only a partial profile. Officers did compare it to her boyfriend and the cab driver, but neither matched. In 2013, the case was reopened by Detective Todd Bonner. Bonner had been one of the first officers on the scene, and it was a case that would continue to haunt him throughout his career. He had heard of a new DNA collection device that did a better job of pulling DNA from porous objects like rocks. It was called the MVAC, and it essentially worked as a mini vacuum. The MVAC system deploys a unique combination of sterile solution spray and a vacuum that dramatically increases DNA uptake, which is a direct quote from the president of the company that manufactures them. It was a new advancement in technology, and Bonner was excited that it could possibly be used to help solve the case. Bonner had requisitioned one of the devices to be brought in to see what it could get from the rocks collected from the crime scene. Forensic scientists were very pleased when they discovered they had a full DNA profile located on the same rock they had found the partial DNA profile before. They ran the DNA through CODIS and got a hit. 46-year-old Joseph Michael Simpson had previously been convicted of murder and had been on parole at the time of Krystal's murder. Simpson had since relocated to Florida after Krystal's murder. Police were able to locate him living with his mother, and officers were flown out to follow him until they witnessed him discarding something with DNA on it. Simpson was a smoker, and it didn't take officers long to retrieve a cigarette butt he left behind. Investigators compared his DNA to the cigarette butt and DNA on the rock, and it was confirmed to match. He had never been considered a suspect before the DNA link. He was arrested in 2013, and it was Bonner who was able to handcuff Simpson. After 18 years, Detective Bonner was able to call Krystal's mother and tell her that he had arrested her daughter's killer. In 2016, he was sentenced to life in prison for aggravated murder, and he was denied any opportunity for parole. It was October 9th in 1988 in Battle Creek, Michigan, when Gayle Barrus disappeared. The 30-year-old single mother of 3 was last seen leaving a coffee shop with a dark-haired man around 3 or 4 a.m. Gayle was a bartender and worked at 2 bars to make ends meet. She was known to often frequent this coffee shop after the bars closed on her way home. She was reported missing the following day when she failed to return home, but police didn't have much to go on. There was an account from a witness that she was seen arguing with 2 men near the coffee shop, but police weren't able to get an identification. 16 days later, Gayle's body was discovered by hunters. She had been dumped on the side of the road in a neighboring county. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed. Oddly, it seems that this case went cold for several decades before being opened again. 2 men were persons of interest, a man suspected of kidnapping and assaulting a different woman only a month prior to Gayle's murder, Roger Plato, and his friend Richard Compton. That woman had survived, and based on her description, the police went to question Roger. When police arrived to bring him in, Plato fled and was shot and killed by officers. Plato died 2 weeks after Gayle had disappeared, and before her body was even discovered. In 2018, Gayle's son James called the Battle Creek PD to get a status update on his mother's murder. Detective Scott Marshall then reopened the file and began the investigation from scratch. He had Richard Compton's body exhumed. He had died in 2019, and detectives were able to get a DNA sample, but it didn't match the DNA that was recovered from Gayle. Detectives then went to find Roger Plato's remains, but discovered that he, his mother, and his sister had all been cremated. They had records showing that blood was taken from Plato, but the sample wasn't with the rest of the evidence collected. In 2020, an officer with the County Sheriff's Department was doing an audit of evidence held in storage and discovered the blood sample taken from Plato as evidence. It seems there had been a miscommunication as to where the sample was supposed to go, but it had never been tested as it should have been in connection to Gayle's cold case. The sample then was shipped to a lab for testing and was a positive match. In an unfortunate case of mismanaged paperwork, this case was finally closed after 33 years. No charges will be laid since Plato is deceased, but the case was able to be closed. Her son James thanked Detective Marshall for his dedication to his mother's case. He said, "It will be our way to close this chapter and gather with family and friends at her grave. It won't change the past, but it will take a weight off our shoulders to get this answered."
A rather surprising end to a murder mystery in Manatee County. Investigators say this man walked into the sheriff's office and revealed a secret he'd been holding on to for nearly 10 years. They say Benjamin Moulton was consumed with guilt when he walked in and confessed to killing a young woman back in 2011.
And as Fox 13's Kimberly Quizon reports tonight, he cleared his conscience and gave a family some much-needed closure.
This state police crime scene video brings you back to the West Street home in Pembroke, where someone's gotten away with murder.
This is a quiet neighborhood. The newest family has been here 10 years.
While neighbors continue to wonder why, the police investigation continues.
It's February 1984. The body of 59-year-old Virginia Hannon is found in her bed under the covers. First responders initially think she's died of natural causes, but nothing is further from the truth.
In 1984, Virginia Hannon was settling into retired life after working for years as a cook and lunch lady at Bryantville Elementary School in Pembroke, Massachusetts. The 59-year-old widow had recently come into some inheritance money and lived alone in her apartment. Then, on February 12, 1984, the unthinkable happened. Someone broke into Virginia's home, where she was beaten, stabbed, and strangled with a pair of her own stockings.
I think it was one of the most brutal murder that I think we've had in the history of Pembroke. She was assaulted, she was kicked, she was punched, she was stabbed, and then strangled.
The senseless murder shocked her family and stumped police, who interviewed more than 50 people during their investigation, but since they couldn't establish any leads or suspects, the case went unsolved. For years, Virginia's family wondered what led to that night. Some speculated that her recent inheritance was a motivator for the crime, as she'd recently collected $380,000 from an aunt. According to her nephew, Virginia had never flaunted the money, but did tell a few friends about it.
Do you think that could have made her a target?
I think it absolutely could have made her a target.
Her family tried to keep the story alive and in the public eye. In 2019, they held a vigil on the 35th anniversary of her death. That same year, investigators discovered the DNA samples taken from the crime scene all belonged to the same man. They just didn't know who he was yet. They tried to use forensic genealogy to identify the suspect, but it was unsuccessful. Her killer remained unknown until one day in February of 2020, when a man walked into the Pembroke Police Department. The man told police that in 2019, his friend, Jesse Aylward, had confessed to killing a woman in Pembroke years prior. Then they learned that Aylward had just died the day before.
Though this investigation has spanned more than 37 years, we have identified Virginia Hannon's killer, and it is Jesse Aylward. We have exhausted all of the evidence that we currently have, and it all points in the direction of Jesse Aylward.
With this tip, the police were able to obtain a search warrant and retrieve a blood sample from Aylward's body at Brockton Hospital. They then compared his DNA to 3 pieces of evidence from the crime scene and confirmed it was a match. Though Virginia's murderer had been identified, her family and the police are still troubled by the lack of motive, which was never established. Police have no reason to believe Virginia and Aylward knew each other, though he lived close to her home at the time of the murder. Aylward had a criminal past which included some assaultive behavior, but the police did not suspect him during their initial investigation. Her family, though feeling somewhat relieved from the revelation, believes there are more people out there with information.
It's nice to have a name, and just to see that the effort that they put in wasn't wasted. And like I said, maybe it'll jar somebody's memory. They can come forward, say something.
Former Police Chief Rick Wall said,
"There's a lot of questions that we still would like to answer, and we may never get all of the answers, but we're never going to, stop looking for exactly what happened."
Virginia is remembered by her family as a woman who took care of stray animals, loved bingo, family cookouts, and ice cubes in her beer glass. "She was a great woman," said her nephew, Richard Hannon. "She was a very family-oriented and loved the area, loved the people around her, and was very generous." On December 11, 2011, a motorist pulled over next to the woods near the University Parkway in Manatee County, Florida, when he came across a body. It was 29-year-old Nicole Rose Scott. She was partially clothed and had visible trauma to her face from an apparent beating. An autopsy later revealed Nicole was strangled to death and that her body had been left in a heavily wooded area for a few days before it was discovered. For the next 10 years, detectives tried to solve Nicole's murder, but made no arrests. One suspect on their radar, though, was Benjamin Moulton. Nicole was a sex worker, and they suspected Moulton of being one of her customers. They questioned Moulton during their investigation, but he denied being involved in Nicole's murder, and without any evidence to link him to the crime, they let him go. A few days prior to Nicole's murder, a pregnant sex worker accused Moulton of trying to kill her. He was arrested for the crime in February 2012 and was charged with attempted murder, sexual battery, and aggravated battery of a pregnant woman. The charges were later dropped, though it is not clear why. Around the same time in 2012, Moulton had criminal charges pending against him for breaking into a woman's home. The woman woke up at around 3 a.m. to find Moulton standing next to her bed. She jumped out of bed and Moulton ran out of the home, but was found soon after. The police later determined he'd removed at least one knife from the woman's kitchen drawer. He pleaded no contest to armed trespassing and was sentenced to probation. Then, 10 years later, on September 29, 2021, 43-year-old Moulton walked into the Manatee County Sheriff's Office and confessed to Nicole's murder.
Really out of the blue, it's an average afternoon, and this guy walks into our lobby and walks up to a deputy and says he wants to confess to a crime that had happened 10 years ago. When he came in and started talking about details of the case that we had never released to the general public, we knew who he was, and it started to really make sense that he was there at the scene and had something to do with her being killed.
When asked why he was admitting to the crime now, he told police he found Jehovah and couldn't live with the guilt anymore. A spokesperson for the Manatee Sheriff's Office said Moulton appeared to have had a major change in his life, that he seemed remorseful and ready to face the consequences of his actions. Moulton was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Nicole Rose Scott. Randy Warren of the Manatee County Sheriff's Office said,
"It's a good day for the Sheriff's Office. It's an even better day for Nicole's family because they can find some comfort in knowing that the guy that killed her was being eaten up with guilt and couldn't live with himself anymore. And it took tremendous courage for him to walk into our lobby and confess and turn himself in.
On November 18, 2020, Decatur Police Department Sean McAdam received one of the strangest calls of his 15-year career. "I want to confess to a murder I did years ago," said the man on the other end of the phone. The man was identified as 53-year-old Johnny Dwight Whited. But Detective McAdam was skeptical of Whited's confession, especially because he couldn't pinpoint what year he committed the murder he was confessing to. "Confessions take a lot of time to get to that point," he said. "You don't start with the confession and work backwards." And yet, that's exactly what they did. After Whited provided police with a description of the crime scene, they reviewed every homicide in the city dating back to the 1980s. Then, they found a match. The April 1995 murder of Christopher Alvin Dailey. Detective McAdam and other officers met with Whited to retrace the steps of the crime. From the back of a patrol car, he guided the officers to a remote, gravelly area where he reenacted the murder. It was there that Christopher's body was found with a single gunshot wound to the head. His 1983 Toyota Tercel was found partially submerged in the Tennessee River, approximately 4 miles away from his body. Christopher was last seen attending an employee meeting at the Huntsville Hilton Hotel, where he worked as a server. He was reported missing the next day on April 26, 1995. Just prior to the police receiving the missing person report, 2 17-year-olds discovered Christopher's body. During their initial investigation, detectives came up empty on suspects, witnesses, weapons, and motives. At the time, Decatur Police Sergeant John Bradford called the case a real whodunit. 25 years later, at the scene of the crime, Whited provided officers with specific details that legitimized his confession. He was then arrested and charged with the death of Christopher Alvin Dailey. Police declined to discuss a potential motive for the murder, but confirmed that Whited and Christopher didn't know each other beforehand. According to Detective McAdam, Whited wanted to get the confession off his chest while he still had time, as he was terminally ill from stage 4 lung cancer. Whited was reportedly remorseful of the crime and apologized multiple times. Detective McAdam credits the original detectives for their work in the case, saying, "They're the ones who did all the hard work. I just closed the last page of the book they wrote." On March 21, 2016, 22-year-old Dontrell Burks was shot and killed while riding his bicycle on the sidewalk in Houston Green's Bayou neighborhood. The murder stunned his family, who described Dontrell as a good kid who always brought people together. At the time, the police didn't have any witnesses to the crime and few leads to go off of, but Dontrell's family determined to find his murderer and wouldn't give up. They followed up on the leads and rumors, and although they never gave up hope, they also never found the closure they were after. His aunt, Angela Burks, described it as feeling like a wild goose chase. She assumed the police would throw Dontrell's case to the side with the other cold cases never to be solved. But then, in October of 2021, a surprise confession changed everything. Roddy was already in jail for a sexual assault charge when police approached him about a different cold case, the 2017 murder of Kitty Paget, who lived on the same block as Dontrell. 34-year-old Kitty was murdered on April 24, 2017, while home in her apartment with her daughter, who was 2 years old at the time. Her daughter was left unharmed, but Kitty was found dead with severe head trauma. Neighbors say that they saw Kitty and Roddy arguing the day she was murdered. Allegedly, Roddy believed that Kitty was bringing prostitution customers to her apartment, and he didn't approve of it. He reportedly prayed before killing her, believing God was leading him to kill her on behalf of her child. At the time, police linked Roddy to Kitty's murder after they found a soda can with his DNA on it, but they didn't have enough evidence to arrest him. In 2020, the police were re-examining Kitty's murder and decided to interview Roddy again. During their meeting, Roddy immediately confessed to the murder of Kitty Paget. and then he said, "There's another one. Do you want to hear about that one?" Roddy then told detectives that he was driving along Northborough Drive when he saw Dontrell on his bike. He claims that Dontrell flashed a gang symbol to Roddy when he passed by, and that Roddy believed Dontrell was falsely claiming to be part of a gang, so he shot and killed him.
My prayers has been answered because I really wanted to know why would he do that to my son.
I am so happy that he had it in his heart to go and confess, to go and just tell the truth.
Police had not previously considered Roddy as a suspect in Dontrell's murder. Sergeant Michael Burrow, who was the one interviewing Roddy, said that the confession caught him completely off guard. He also said that Roddy had experienced a religious conversion and wanted to get the confession off of his chest. Roddy has also been linked to other crimes, including a robbery, a sexual assault of a female jogger. He is also claimed to have attacked other women in a similar manner. 30-year-old Roddy is currently in jail on 5 charges, including the murder of Dontrell Burks and the murder of Kitty Paget, with his bond set at over $1 million. On August 24, 1998, Sondra Better was working a closing shift alone in a Delray Beach, Florida consignment store. Only weeks away from retirement, the 68-year-old woman enjoyed her work at Luche's Consignment. The wife and mother of 3 grown daughters didn't need to work, but instead she loved being around people and preferred being at the store than being at home. The store was filled with vintage furniture, decor, collectibles, and it was located in a strip mall that was known for amazing thrift stores. Her husband, Zeke Better, recalled her love of the store and loved getting dolled up for work. The two had just celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. The couple had met in Brooklyn, New York in 1948 and had been happily married ever since. The two had plans to go back to New York to renew their vows, and the trip was to take place after her last shift at the store. On that August day, 2 teenagers had walked by the consignment store and noticed it was still open 30 minutes after it normally closed. They popped in to check to see if the store was still open, and to their shock, found Sondra, beaten and covered in blood, lying on the store's floor. 911 was called and EMTs determined that Sondra had died of her wounds. She had been stabbed several times and her throat had a large gash. There was a massive amount of blood all throughout the store. Sondra had several defensive injuries on her hands and arms, indicating she had fought her attacker hard. The cash register had been emptied, leading the police to believe that that may have been the motive. However, the killer didn't take Sondra's Rolex watch or the large diamond engagement ring she wore. Police had a witness statement made by a customer who'd been in the store about half-hour before the teens had made the horrific discovery. She described being in the store with Sondra and a Caucasian man who was tall, skinny, and haggling the price of a couch with Sondra. Another witness said she briefly popped into the store right before closing time and saw a man at the cash register talking to the store clerk. The descriptions matched the other witness's account. She didn't stay in the store long, nor did she remember seeing anyone else in the store. Police set up a sketch and released it to the media. The best evidence found in the shop was that it appeared the killer had cut himself in the process of murdering Sondra. Although it was mostly Sondra's blood tracked throughout the store, there was another person's blood on the cash register, door, and a set of decorative balls near Sondra. There were also fingerprints, which, along with the blood, were put in the national databases. There were no immediate hits, and without any further leads, the case went cold. Police had interviewed 37 suspects, one man who had gone to the hospital that day with a laceration on his hand, another who had been reported to police for abruptly leaving town and relocating to the Midwest, and a man who was far too interested in the investigation. None matched the killer's DNA or prints. Zeke Better, devastated by the loss of his wife, set up a scholarship fund for criminal justice students in his wife's name. He also spent every remaining year of his life volunteering for the Delray Beach Police Department until his death in 2015. In 2018, the Delray Beach Police Department got an unexpected call. After 20 years, they had received a fingerprint match on the Sondra Better murder case. The prints belonged to Todd Barquette, a 51-year-old man living in Brandon, Florida, who had applied for a job as a nursing assistant, which had required him to submit fingerprints for a criminal record check. Back in 1998, Barquette had been living in a mobile home near Lantana, 10 miles from Delray Beach. He also matched the suspect's description. He was 6'2" with light hair, and even 20 years later, he was still very slim. Barquette was never a suspect before his prints came up.
All right, so what would you like to know?
What this is pertaining to.
Okay, so...
Never been in trouble for anything other than some speeding tickets and stuff.
Speeding tickets? Yeah. Okay. Just raise your right hand.
Sure.
Can you just state your name?
Todd Barquette. Todd Eric Barquette.
Okay, and your birthday?
January 8th, 1968.
Okay, and you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth?
I do.
Okay. All right, so, like I said, we're from Delray.
Okay.
Have you ever been to Delray?
Yeah, my wife and I lived on the East Coast. I think we moved down there 95, 96, I think.
You moved on the East Coast? Where did you live?
East Coast, originally Lantana.
Okay.
Then we lived in, Lantana. We had an apartment in Boynton. We had a house in unincorporated Palm Beach, which could now be part of Lake Worth, I guess.
Okay.
And then Lake Worth also.
Okay. And when did you... Oh, is this the wife?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. When did you leave Palm Beach County?
When the first recession hit, that was 2007, I guess. Late 2006, early 2007.
Okay.
We moved to South Carolina for about 18 months.
Oh, okay. And then you moved here to Tampa?
Then came back down.
Oh, okay. All right. And when you were in Palm Beach County, what did you do for work?
Worked for various mortgage companies. I started with a small mortgage banker in Boca. Phoenix Mortgage, I think, was my first job down there. But then I worked for Countrywide. I worked for Bank of America.
Okay. And what did your wife do for work?
She was she started down there as a nurse recruiter.
Okay.
Staffing recruiter.
Oh, she's a nurse here?
Yes,
and
she's done some CNA work, and then she was a per diem recruiter and staffer for cross-country staffing.
Okay, so various, like, nursing, medical.
Medical field, basically.
Okay. All right, so we're basically here because we're investigating a murder that happened a couple years ago. It was a number of years ago, and your name obviously came up, so that's why we're here. Have you ever been in Delray?
Yeah, a lot of times.
Okay. What was your purpose of going to Delray?
Normally we'd go downtown, usually like a Friday night or Saturday night, down to, Atlantic Boulevard, I think?
Yeah, East Atlantic, where all the bars and restaurants are?
Yeah.
Okay. Have you ever gone to a consignment shop called Lachey's?
Possible. We used to do some stuff where we'd buy antiques or stuff, or just look around, cute little stuff.
Okay. Any way that you would be in a South Federal Highway?
A lot, but not for any particular reason.
Okay.
Just because it was one of the main north-south roads.
Okay. Where did you usually go to consignment shops at?
Boca.
In Lantana? Boca?
Yeah.
Okay.
There were a couple nice ones down there.
Have you ever gone to any ones in Delray?
Not that I remember. I mean, if they were on Atlantic, maybe.
Okay.
But
do you remember anything that you picked up or dropped off at one of the shops?
No, I don't think we ever sold anything. It was usually just buying knickknacks.
Buying them?
Yeah.
Got anything still that you bought?
God,
no.
Probably not. When we relocated we were living in Deerfield Beach when the financial crisis hit. We moved up to South Carolina and we sold a lot of stuff to facilitate the move because we just had no money. When we were in South Carolina, we bought a lot of stuff, then moved back down thinking we were going to downsize. We got rid of about a third of our stuff, also to help pay for the move. Moving from a couple different spots in Tampa, kids are grown, so we've just downsized so often. I probably don't, other than photos, I don't think I have anything that's more than 7 or 8 years old.
Okay. How old are your kids?
30 and 28.
Oh, okay. All right. All right, so mostly you were in Boca. If you had to do some consignment, Boca, and if it was Delray, it was Atlantic Avenue. You never really went anywhere other than that. Okay. All right.
And it's possible we would have sold something. Honestly, I don't know. And my wife likes to buy, we buy a lot of vintage clothing. I guess you call it vintage, used clothing.
Just clothes, okay.
Because it saves money, but...
Would she remember?
It's possible, I don't know.
Maybe we'll talk. I know she walked up here, maybe we'll talk to her, see if she remembers.
I'll ask. I mean, that's 20 years ago, I don't know.
He had a minimal criminal history, mostly traffic citations. He had married and he'd been working at a retirement home for many years. When his picture was shown to one of the witnesses, she immediately picked him out of a group, identifying him as a man she saw in the store right before Sondra's murder. He was arrested in March 2018 and police were able to get a DNA sample and match it to the blood found on the cash register and the door. Police also noted a significant scar running from the right side of his mouth down under the right side of his chin. Barquette said he had been attacked by a dog, but police compared the scar to his driver's license, noting he had the scar after his 2002 license renewal photo. When the case went to trial, Barquette pleaded not guilty. His lawyers argued that he had gone to the store that day with a cut on his hand and touched a few of the items. He said no one was at the cash register and decided to steal the money on impulse. He denied ever murdering Sondra, but jurors didn't buy the story. After only a 90-minute deliberation, they came back with a guilty verdict. Todd Barquette was found guilty on August 23, 2019 for the murder of Sondra Better and sentenced to life in prison. On November 17, 1997, Jane Morton Antunez left her parents' home at 7:30 p.m. Recently divorced, the 30-year-old woman had moved back in with her parents in Atascadero, California, while she sorted out the next chapter of her life. That evening, she was supposed to go to her best friend's house, but never arrived. The following morning, Jane's family discovered that Jane was neither at home nor with her friend. After calling around and not locating her, her older brother offered to drive around and see if he could find her car. The car was parked on a side road off of Highway 101 and was only a mile from the house. As he got closer to the vehicle, he immediately knew something wasn't right, and he made the grisly discovery of his sister's lifeless body. Jane was in the back seat of the vehicle, her throat slit, and she'd been sexually assaulted. There was little evidence as to what had happened. Jane didn't pick up hitchhikers, and there weren't any obvious mechanical issues with the vehicle. No clues as to how someone had gotten to her. Her case quickly went cold, but it wasn't the only tragedy to hit Atascadero. 2 months following Jane's murder, Patricia Dwyer, a 28-year-old woman, was found murdered in her home. She had been stabbed in the chest and had also been sexually assaulted. In both cases, the women had had their hands similarly tied behind their backs. As we know from the Golden State Killer attacks, knot tying can be very distinctive. Although close in age and having few mutual acquaintances, the women didn't know each other, nor did they have any overlapping interests. The night that Patricia was murdered, she had told a friend that afternoon that she had plans to go to the grocery store and needed to get some cleaning done. The same friend had popped over for a visit the following day and discovered Patricia's body. The investigation immediately connected the two women slain, but much like the first murder, there was little to go on. There were no signs of forced entry into Patricia's home, but police also acknowledged that Patricia kept a key under the doormat to her front door. Police had been very public with their opinion that they were looking for one perpetrator. They handed out hundreds of flyers with the cases on them, hopeful that someone remembered something of value to the case, but they also used the campaign to remind women to lock their cars, lock their homes, and to not let strangers into their homes or vehicles. By the fall of 1978, both cases were cold. None of the suspects panned out, and years later, one by one, they were cleared by DNA. In 2005, the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office reopened the case and uploaded samples of the DNA collected from the crime scenes to the national databases. There were no immediate hits, but the DNA would continually be sampled randomly in the automatic system. On June 21, 2017, the case was given new light when the sheriff's detective Clint Cole reopened the case again.
Well, I try not to get too hopeful. But when you know there's good evidence, like in this case, you it's nice to know that. It's reassuring to know that there's a very strong chance that you're going to solve the case. When you have DNA evidence, it's really the golden ticket in most cases. What I do is I go through some of the reports that are online, looking for DNA evidence, fingerprint evidence. You don't want to just close it and think that you're on the right track. You want to know. You want to know that it's the person. And in this case, we do know that. And as a matter of fact, the first person that I called when I knew we had a confirmation on the hit was former Chief Deputy John Hasty, who was the sergeant in charge of these cases, and congratulated him because they solved the case as much as I did. I didn't do anything special. They're the ones that did by collecting the evidence.
His investigation led to opening up the search to include familial matches in the national databases, and after 40 years, they had a clear lead. The close familial match happened to be an incarcerated inmate, and it only took investigators a brief conversation to get a lead suspect. Arthur Rudy Martinez had lived in Atascadero in 1977 and had moved in the winter of 1978. He had been a suspect in the initial investigation, but there was no evidence to tie him to the crimes at the time. In 1977, Martinez had been on parole for attempted murder and rape charges. He had also been working as a welder in the area, but after the murder of Patricia Dwyer, he relocated to Spokane, Washington. While in Washington, he committed multiple robberies and sexual assaults, and he was charged and sentenced to life in prison. In 1994, he escaped prison and lived in Fresno, California area for 20 years. In 2014, he turned himself in to authorities because he had cancer and needed to receive medical treatments. His decision to turn himself in came too late, and 2 months after returning to prison, he died from cancer. Detectives were able to track down Martinez's girlfriend, and she had a box of his personal effects. The box contained his razor, and from that, investigators were able to pull enough DNA to test it against the semen DNA collected from 1977. The samples matched, officially linking Martinez to the assaults of Jane Morton Antunez and Patricia Dwyer. Unfortunately, there will be no additional charges laid or a criminal trial. However, another cold case can be closed. February 16, 1974 in Fort Worth, Texas was a day full of excitement. That Saturday, Carla Walker spent the afternoon getting ready for a Valentine's Day dance at her high school. Carla was 17, a cheerleader, and a very popular Spitfire who had her whole life ahead of her. Carla was to attend the dance with her boyfriend, Rodney. He was a year older than her and a quarterback of the football team. Friends described the couple as the perfect high school sweethearts. Friends said that Carla's family adored Rodney. Though they were young, the couple had already started making plans for their future, and Carla's family already considered Rodney a part of their family, welcoming him with open arms. The dance was full of fun, full of laughter, and although the event was chaperoned, teens have a way of eluding authority. Rodney said that the couple partook in sipping from a flask and smoked a small amount of pot. Carla and Rodney left the dance a little early with a group of friends. The group went to a local eatery and grabbed some snacks and hung out for a bit. Carla and Rodney bid their friends goodnight and drove off. The teens didn't head straight home. Instead, the couple went to a popular hangout, the local bowling alley. They went in briefly to use the washrooms, then returned to the car. The parking lot was close to empty, and they had parked in an even more secluded area. They were sitting in the backseat of the car, chatting, laughing, and the two began kissing. Carla was leaned against the passenger door. They were absorbed in their activities and didn't notice a man approach the vehicle. The stranger opened the passenger door, and because Carla had been leaning her full body weight on the door, she quickly tumbled out of the car. Rodney had attempted to grab her when the man repeatedly started hitting Rodney in the head with something hard. The stranger put the object against his head, and only then did Rodney realize the item was a pistol. Rodney heard Carla say, "I'll go with you, just don't shoot him." Rodney heard the gun go off once, and he thought he'd been shot. The man then pointed the gun in his face and pulled the trigger a couple of times, but the gun made an empty click. The gun wasn't loaded. The assailant then hit Rodney again with the weapon, and this time Rodney was knocked unconscious. Rodney didn't see the man lead his girlfriend away. The last thing he remembered was Carla screaming, "Go get my dad." Roddy didn't know how much time had passed before he'd regained consciousness. He jumped back into the car and drove on autopilot to Carla's house. He tumbled through their front door covered in blood. Carla's father then drove to the bowling alley, which now was closed, and was joined by police. Police and volunteers undertook an extensive search. They searched by foot, by horseback, and by helicopter. Rodney's description of the man was clean-cut, Caucasian, slender. He had short, wavy hair, a thick Texas drawl, average height, and was wearing a shiny green sleeveless vest and a white cowboy hat. At the abduction site, police found a magazine for a .22 caliber Ruger pistol. While Rodney was the initial suspect, police didn't have much to go on. After 3 days of searching, police discovered Carla's body. She was partially clad in a ditch near Lake Benbrook. Police determined there had been evidence to suggest Carla had been held captive, tortured, sexually assaulted, and injected with morphine. The autopsy estimated her time of death of Monday, meaning she had been held captive for roughly 24 to 36 hours. Her cause of death was strangulation. Police received 200 tips from the public, and several suspects were investigated. One such man was a previously convicted car thief who lived less than a mile from the bowling alley. Glenn Samuel McCurley was a truck driver who was off work the night of the abduction and had no alibi because his wife was away that weekend. He was initially picked up because he had recently purchased new bullets for his .22 caliber Ruger pistol, a gun that had matched the magazine that was found at the abduction site. He had said his gun had been stolen while he'd been fishing. The date he gave for the theft of the weapon was around the same time as Carla's abduction, and he told police he hadn't reported it stolen because he had a criminal record. He was eventually released because there was no evidence to directly link him to the crime, and police focused on other suspects. Over the years, several people came forward attaching themselves to the case. However, all were able to be eliminated. Police did have key evidence, but needed to wait until technology could catch up. DNA was found on Carla's clothing and preserved. In the 1990s, the DNA was input into the national databases, but nothing came up. In April 2019, police received a letter from a person claiming to be the man who had abducted and murdered Carla. Police put that letter out on social media and asked for the man to come forward. In September 2019, police joined forces with Ortham Incorporated, a private lab in Texas. Ortham was able to pull a full genetic profile of the suspect. Using familial genealogy, the lab was able to reverse engineer a family tree. They were able to narrow it down to 3 brothers, all with the last name McCurley. Cold case investigators recognized the last name as it matched one of the initial suspects. In July of 2019, police collected a sample of McCurley's DNA from discarded trash. Following a positive match, they were able to obtain an arrest warrant. After his arrest, he submitted 2 additional DNA samples, which both tested positive. This solidified investigators' belief they had found the right man. 46 years after Carla's murder, her killer would face a grand jury. Now 77, Glenn Samuel McCurley faces a capital murder charge and is being held on a $100,000 bond. After the arrest, Carla's family said it brought them relief to have answers and justice for Carla, finally. Hopefully, it also brought a relief to Rodney, now in his 60s, who has lived his entire adult lifehood under a cloud of suspicion. Although he was never a named suspect, there was always a cloud of doubt in the court of public opinion that followed him. At this time, there are no further court dates. McCurley has not obtained legal counsel, though there will likely be updated court dates in the new year. Well, that's going to be it for this video. Through the coming months and years, I believe we will begin to see a massive influx of cold cases being solved by DNA. It seems that every few weeks new stories come up and old cold cases can finally be solved. Sometimes we get the justice we desperately want to see. Other times we just get a resolution.
In sleepy Terre Haute, Indiana, the shocking murder made headlines. 19-year-old Pamela Milam was found by her father, stuffed in the trunk of her own car, tied up and strangled by a murder suspect who eluded police for 47 years.
Pamela Milam was a 19-year-old student studying at Indiana State University. Pamela, inspired by those who had taught her, was working towards becoming an English teacher. On September 15, 1972, ISU was having their rush week, and Pamela had been a member of the Sigma Kappa sorority. She told some of her friends that she had wanted to move her car, and she left the Homestead Hall. Pamela said she would only be a few minutes, but never returned. Pamela didn't live on campus, and she commuted to school daily from her childhood home she shared with her younger sister and parents. No one at the sorority party thought anything was suspicious when Pamela didn't return. They had assumed she had gone home. The next morning, Pamela didn't show up for work, and this concerned her family. It was very unlike Pam to be so irresponsible. On September 16th, two of Pam's friends spotted her 1964 Pontiac Le Mans in a parking lot about a block away from where it had been the previous day. They could see Pam's glasses in the vehicle. The girls called Pam's house, and her father and sister Sheila decided to bring a spare set of keys to check out the car. When her father popped the trunk, what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Pamela had been stuffed inside the trunk of her vehicle. Her hands were tied behind her back, and she had been gagged, and there was tape over her mouth. She had rope around her neck, which was the same product used to bind her hands. The thin white rope appeared to be clothing line. She had leaves and dirt on her body and caught in the layers of her pantyhose and pants. There were no witnesses, but the police did a thorough investigation. The lead investigator insisted on the collection of soil and trace evidence that at the time there had been no way of testing, but he believed that science would one day catch up and it may be useful. DNA was collected from Pam's blouse. With no witnesses or enemies, the case went cold. Authorities believed that a man who had been arrested 7 weeks after Pamela's murder had been responsible. He had been arrested in connection to several assaults on campus. However, police were never able to link Robert Wayne Austin to Pamela. No one knew at the time that all that evidence that had been collected from the initial crime scene would eventually come to light, but at the time, it would be tucked away in the back of a storage room, waiting. In 2008, newly appointed Terre Haute Police Chief Sean Keane handed out cold cases to each of his detectives. Keane felt it was unfair that he didn't have a case, so he assigned himself the unsolved murder of Pamela Milam. Keane said that as soon as he opened the file, he couldn't put it down. He brought it home and irritated his wife by spreading the crime scene photos in their living room. He tested the DNA found at the scene and tested it against the lead suspect, Robert Wayne Austin, but was quickly able to eliminate him. It wasn't a match. He worked the case for 11 years, manually removing hundreds of suspects. Pamela's parents mourned differently. They unfortunately passed before any breaks in the case were ever discovered. In 2018, Keane made a decision that would either make or keep the case cold forever. He had sent the last usable sample of DNA to Parabon Nanolabs, the Virginia-based lab that was known for using DNA from companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com to reverse engineer family trees. This company was most notable in identifying the Golden State Killer, John D. Miller, who murdered April Marie Tinsley, and William Talbot, who was arrested in connection to the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya von Kuhlenberg. Parabon was able to connect the DNA to a distant female cousin.
They would have never been able to solve this crime until, as the chief said, technology caught up with it.
They mapped out additional family members and could begin narrowing a suspect down from the family tree. Based on the results, Keane conducted interviews and narrowed it down to a single suspect, Jeffrey Hand.
A nearly 50-year-old cold case is solved. Terre Haute police have identified the man they say killed Indiana State University student Pamela Milam. Police Chief Sean Keane announced the break today. He says a DNA sample from the son of Jeffrey Lynn Hand was used to prove the hand that killed Milam in 1972.
Keene was disappointed to learn that Hand had already died, but used a reverse paternity DNA test to confirm that Hand had killed Pamela. Jeffrey Hand had been 23 at the time of Pamela's murder. Hand didn't live in Terre Haute, but he had lived there some years past. In 1972, Hand had been working for a Chicago-based record company, delivering records to stores throughout Illinois and Indiana. He was around the age of university goers. He was familiar with the area, which may have contributed to how he navigated the campus unnoticed. He was young, had light hair, soft-voiced features. He didn't look dangerous. Less than a year after Pam's death, Hand had picked up 2 hitchhikers, Jeffrey Thomas and his new wife. The couple were hitchhiking back after visiting friends in Chicago. Hand had picked them up just south of Terre Haute, and on the drive he told the couple he needed to stop at his sister's house to see about getting some money. Hand pulled over, drawing a pistol, and he demanded money from the couple. The couple showed them they didn't have any money, which may have explained why they had been hitchhiking. Hand forced them into a grain bin and told them he was holding them for ransom. After waiting for a bit, Hand took Thomas out of his wife's sight. They were gone for a while, and while they'd been gone, she was able to escape the bin and run to a nearby home for help. When police arrived, they were able to arrest Hand quickly. Hand also led them to Thomas's lifeless body, which had been discarded in a weedy area. Thomas's autopsy revealed he'd been killed by a gunshot wound to the head, but had also been stabbed in the chest 8 times and had his throat slit. His hands had also been tied behind his back, much like Pam's had been. Hand never served time for the slaying of Jeffrey Thomas. At his trial, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity for both the murder and the kidnapping charges. He was, however, committed to a state reformatory for 2 years. Hand's last encounter with the law was in January 1978. In a mall parking lot, an off-duty deputy was in the right place at the right time. He witnessed a man attempting to abduct a woman. He yelled out, at which point Hand ran. The deputy called for backup and pursued. Hand shot at the officer, injuring him. The fire was returned, and Hand was fatally shot as he ran away. Hand died as a result of his injuries in 1978. He was 29 at the time of his death.
Many of us, as we got older, thought we would die before we ever learned who had killed our sister.
Pamela's family was relieved to hear that Hand had not lived a full life. However, it was bittersweet knowing that he would never face justice for the years he stole from them. They were grateful that he had been stopped before more young women could have been harmed. I hope his life of crime was a short one, although given that he had already established a pattern and preference, there may be more discoveries linking him to more crimes in the future.
She was a joy to be around, and that's what we miss. We miss not having her there for family get-togethers. I miss that my children and grandchildren will never ever get to meet someone who would have been a terrific aunt to them.
On July 18, 1979, Warren Matott called the Salt Lake City Police Department to report his wife as a missing person. It had been 8 days since 37-year-old Sondra Matott was last seen in a bar in Salt Lake City, Utah. She was wearing a digital watch and a ring with a turquoise stone at the time of her disappearance, and she also wore dentures, which she often took out because they were ill-fitting and hurt her mouth. The police department started their investigation into Sondra's disappearance immediately. However, when they called to follow up with Sondra's husband to discuss his missing wife, they couldn't reach him. Eventually, they lost contact with him completely, and the investigation made little headway. 1 month after Sondra's disappearance, 200 miles from where Sondra had disappeared in Millard County, Utah, a grisly discovery was made. A hunting party had found human remains off the I-15 Cove Fort exit, close to the old 91 road. Since the remains were almost all skeletal and there were no obvious signs that pointed to a cause of death, police couldn't immediately identify who the remains belonged to. They did, however, find jewelry at the scene and saw that the skull was missing teeth. The case was given the moniker the Toothless Jane Doe. The Millard County Sheriff's Office opened a homicide investigation and tried to identify the body by sending out bulletins, reaching out to the community, and commissioning a sketch based on the skull, but they had no success. And due to the lack of technology and communication between the counties, the connection to Sondra was never made. 5 years later in Salt Lake City, there was a potential break in Sandra's case. Serial killer Henry Lee Lucas had been apprehended and confessed to killing Sanda Matott. The lead investigator and sheriff met with Lucas, but his claims about the crime were vague, and they couldn't confirm his confession was legitimate. Lucas couldn't provide enough details about the murder to prove to investigators that he was responsible for it. Years later, Lucas recanted his confessions to hundreds of murders across the U.S. and was only found responsible for a handful. It was back to the drawing board for the investigators. In early 2013, a Salt Lake City Police Department detective was reassigned to Sandra's case. The detective first established that Sandra was still missing after all these years, and so he entered her case information into 2 missing persons databases. During this time, Sandra's family reported that they believed Warren Matott, her husband, was likely responsible for her murder. They also believed that Sandra was missing long before her husband had actually reported it, which may have conflicted with the original timeline. This would have been a time for police to reach out to Warren for further questioning, but they discovered that he had died in California on October 11, 1999. In 2019, the Millard County Sheriff's Office started looking into their Jane Doe case again. That same year, a state law was passed that made it mandatory for state crime labs to enter their unidentified remains into national databases for missing people. So in February of 2019, Sandra was added to the Utah's cold case database as a missing person. Her case information was also added to the federal database that helps law enforcement personnel identify and prosecute violent criminals nationally. Sergeant Pat Bennett of the Millard County Sheriff's Office then joined the Toothless Jane Doe case and began to search the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NamUs, to try and find an ID match. That's when he came across Sandra's case file. He saw that she was wearing a watch and a ring with a turquoise stone at the time of her disappearance, which matched the details of the unidentified remains found just 1 month after she had been reported missing. In November of 2019, Bennett reached out to the Salt Lake City Police Department about his hunch, and they started to work together to get a DNA comparison. By December, Utah's forensic anthropologist had completed a report that allowed the unidentified remains of the Toothless Jane Doe to be sent to the University of Texas's Human Identification Center for DNA testing. The remains were sent in October of 2020, and on August 10, 2021, it was confirmed. The unidentified remains belonged to Sandra Matott. On August 13, 2021, the Millard County Sheriff's Office and Salt Lake City Police Department gave Sandra's family the closure that they had been waiting for. "We are happy the case is now closed because it brings us some answers," said her son, Daryl Hames. "As a family, we are happy about this development, but also sad it took this long. 42 years is a long time, and we are happy that the investigators never closed the case and continued to work on it, so we could reach this point."
Right? At the police station, yeah, I shed a tear, and I haven't cried in years over my mom, but I did shed a tear at the police station. But I'm more happy that I have closure, and, I'm talking to the sisters and stuff like that. She was missing for all this time, so we kind of grew apart, but now with the closure, we're coming back together.
Sandra's family planned to have her cremated and have her ashes made into jewelry for her sisters. The Utah Medical Examiner's Office could not confirm a cause of death for Sandra, but detectives believe her husband knew more about her death than anyone else. Though there was never a probable cause to charge him in connection with her disappearance or murder while he was alive. Her son said that their family had long suspected Warren's involvement in Sandra's disappearance, as there had been a history of domestic abuse in the relationship. Even before the case was closed, the family had assumed he knew what had happened to her. "We knew it was him that killed her and disposed of the body," said Daryl. "It is bittersweet to not have justice in this case, but Sandra's family now has some answers to what happened to her so many years ago." It was October 15, 1981, when 30-year-old Sonia Carmen was alone at her Monterey County, California home while her 4-year-old daughter was at school. The Quebec native was a single mother and worked as a merchandiser for the Levi Strauss & Company, more commonly known today as Levi's. Around noon, her friend Caroline McBride stopped by, only to find a horrible scene. Sonia, partially clothed and lying dead on her living room floor. The Monterey County Sheriff's Office arrived at Sonia's home in Rio Avenue soon after and began their investigation. Sonia had a pair of pantyhose around her throat, which detectives determined that had been used to strangle her to death. The next day, detectives spoke with Sonia's 25-year-old neighbor, Michael Scott Glazebrook, who lived across the street from her. After noting a fresh scratch on his face, they immediately identified him as a suspect and brought him in for a police interview, during which he appeared to be nervous. A friend of Glazebrook told them that he had admitted to being in Sonia's home the morning that she was killed. The police arrested Glazebrook on December 18, 1981, and charged him with the murder of Sonia. But during Glazebrook's preliminary hearings, many conflicting reports and issues arose. There were conflicting reports about whether or not Sonia had been sexually assaulted. Some of Glazebrook's own statements had to be thrown out, and the friend who had testified that Glazebrook admitted to being in Sonia's home recanted their first statements. In August of 1983, Glazebrook's second preliminary hearing was held, during which even more evidence against him was thrown out of court. Glazebrook was questioned about the murder after being taken into custody over traffic warrants, but the investigators prevented him from making bail on the traffic warrants and didn't allow him to make a telephone call, and they also didn't inform his wife of his arrest. Glazebrook's trial was held in November of 1983, where witnesses came forward in his defense. One witness stated that Glazebrook's truck was gone from his home at the time of the murder, and another one gave him an alibi. Some witnesses even testified that the reports made by the detectives conflicted with what they had said to them in their own statements. Glazebrook's attorney defended his client, saying that he could have gotten the scratch on his face from playing softball on the afternoon of the murder, and Glazebrook's parents said that they were with him most of the afternoon of the murder and denied that he had a scratch on his face at all. With a mountain of conflicting statements before them, the jury couldn't agree on Glazebrook's innocence or guilt. 9 jurors voted to acquit him, and 3 determined he was guilty. In the end, the trial resulted in a hung jury. The district attorney's office decided not to retry the case, and the murder charges against Glazebrook were dismissed. William Curtis, the district attorney for Monterey County at the time, said he didn't feel he could successfully prosecute Glazebrook with the evidence available at the time. The evidence included blood that was found under one of Sonia's fingernails, but the lab technicians at the time couldn't confirm who the blood belonged to, only that it wasn't Sonia's. In late 2020, detectives at the Monterey County Sheriff's Office and Deputy District Attorney Matt Leroux re-examined the case. They discovered there were several pieces of evidence that could be re-examined with the newer DNA technology that wasn't available during the initial investigation. So they sent it to the Department of Justice DNA lab to be tested. They also obtained a search warrant to obtain a DNA sample from Glazebrook, who was still living and working in Monterey County. It was indeed a match for the evidence found at the crime scene. On August 14, 2021, Glazebrook was arrested during a traffic stop in Seaside, where he worked as a school bus driver. Police say the 65-year-old didn't seem surprised when he was arrested. During the operation to arrest Glazebrook, all of the detectives involved wore Levi's in honor of Sonia. Glazebrook was charged with first-degree murder and booked into the Monterey County Jail with his bail set at $1 million. He was arraigned on August 14, 2021, pleaded not guilty to the charges, and had his preliminary hearing on September 1, 2021. By March of 1987, 20-year-old Darlene Krashoc already had a few years of U.S. Army experience under her belt. She had enlisted right after graduating high school and was stationed at Fort Carlson in Colorado, working as a mechanic. She was just 5 months shy of turning 21 and had plans to re-enlist and attend the Army Airborne School. But on March 17th, her dreams were cut short. At 5:20 a.m., 2 Colorado Springs Police Department officers were patrolling an area 6 miles from Fort Carson when they found Darlene's body behind the Korean Club restaurant. Darlene had last been seen the night prior with fellow members of her Army unit. They had gone to a club called Shuffles, and Darlene was last seen leaving there with an unidentified man between midnight and 1 a.m. Investigators listed her cause of death as strangulation and determined that she had also been sexually assaulted. They believe Darlene was murdered at a different location before the killer moved her body. Special agents from the United States Army Criminal Investigation Command immediately began working with the Colorado Springs Police Department to solve the case. But even after collecting evidence from the crime scene and conducting hundreds of interviews, the case went cold. 16 years passed with no leads on Darlene's murder. But during that time, one thing that did progress was DNA testing and forensic technology. In October of 2003, Darlene's case was reopened to use this new technology to examine the crime scene evidence. The Colorado Springs Police Department released all of their evidence to the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Laboratory's examiners, who processed it using phenotype technology and put out a $10,000 reward for information on the case. Still, they had no suspect. Over 10 years later, in September of 2014, forensic science officer Jessica Veltri was assigned to the case. As a recent grad of the George Washington University Forensic Science program, Veltri was very interested in cold cases and was eager to put her forensic knowledge to use. In 2016, Veltri submitted 27 pieces of evidence to the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Laboratory in Georgia for DNA forensic testing that was not available prior, and they reanalyzed all of the previously submitted items. In December of that year, the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Command enlisted the help of Parabon Nanolabs, who specializes in DNA phenotyping. Their phenotyping can predict a person's physical appearance and ancestry based on unidentified DNA evidence. By January 2017, they had established a trait prediction of Darlene's murderer. Based on this prediction, they created a composite image of the suspect at 20 to 25 years old and then at 50 to 50 years old. But this still wasn't enough to find Darlene's murderer. In 2019, the forensic scientists at Parabon turned to the ancestry and genealogy websites 23andMe and Ancestry.com to help find distant relatives to the DNA sample found at the crime scene so they could reverse engineer a family tree. They found people in Wisconsin and Texas who had similar DNA to the sample and were able to trace their genealogy to one distant cousin, Michael White. They compared the name against military records and found out that White was a retired first-class sergeant stationed at Fort Carson at the time of Darlene's murder. The Colorado Springs Police Department then ran a surveillance operation on White, who still lived in the area where the murder had occurred. They followed him to a fast food restaurant, and after White threw out his garbage, they collected the cup he drank from. The DNA from the cup was a positive match for the DNA found at the crime scene. On June 13, 2019, 58-year-old Michael White was arrested at his home. White maintained his innocence and entered a not guilty plea. After less than 2 weeks of trial and less than 1 day of deliberation, the El Paso County jury found White guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The verdict was a relief for Darlene's family after a long 34 years.
We'll always miss her.
Yes.
We'll always remember, but I think it will be easier to go on now from day to day knowing that her justice has been done.
It was November 28, 1980 in Denver, Colorado when Kristen K. Swanson finished her waitressing shift at the Ramada Inn. The 22-year-old was last seen leaving her work parking lot. She borrowed a friend's vehicle and was going home to shower and change for a party later that evening. She never made it to the party, which drew concern from her friends and fiancé, all of whom were unable to locate her that evening. Her body was discovered by a bus driver the following morning in the vehicle she had borrowed. She was stabbed once in the chest and had been assaulted. Her autopsy determined that her cause of death was a stab wound to the heart. The subsequent investigation quickly led to several dead ends. In her case, like so many others of the time, it went cold. DNA evidence was collected and preserved to await technology that didn't exist yet. For years, those who remembered Kristen continued to advocate on her behalf. In 2009, the Denver Police Department reopened the investigation after a friend of Kristen had urged investigators to re-examine the evidence. It didn't take long for investigators to have a suspect. Once the samples were uploaded to the national databases, they had a hit from an ex-felon with a lengthy criminal record. Roderick Bernard Elias, now 53, was arrested in March 2010. In 1980, he had been out on parole and was living with his brother in the Denver area. Images of him in 1980 matched the description of a man that had been hanging around outside the hotel bar that Kristen had worked at. It is believed that he followed her and may have forced her off the road or somehow convinced her to pull over, then attacked her. He had been arrested in 1973 for aggravated assault, released, then was back in prison in 1978 for theft and burglary. Then he was in and out of prison for the better part of the 80s and 90s for burglary, possession of burglary tools, theft, criminal damage to property, and attempted robbery. Despite him matching the description of a person of interest and his criminal history, Elias had never been a suspect in the slaying of Kristen Swanson. At this time, it is unclear why he targeted Kristen, and Denver police are not looking into any other cold cases in the area to see if there are other victims. Kristen's mother and sister were ecstatic about the arrest and grateful to have justice after so many years. On January 2, 1959, in Great Falls, Montana, Patricia Patti Kalitzke went out on a date with her boyfriend, Lloyd Duane Bogle. The two had gone to a drive-in movie, and after the movie, there was a little time before Patti needed to go home. Patti was a junior in high school, and Lloyd was an airman stationed at the Malmstrom Air Force Base. Though the two hadn't been dating for long, they were very serious and had even started talking about marriage. The two parked next to the Sun River near Wadsworth Park, a common lover's lane. That evening, as the clock ticked on, Patti's parents grew increasingly nervous. It wasn't like her not to come home, and it was initially thought that the young couple might have gone off to elope. It wasn't uncommon for two people to get swept up in love. When night turned to day, their concerns turned to terror when the body of Bogle was discovered near his vehicle. His body had been discovered by 3 young boys. He had his hands tied behind his back and had been shot once in the back of the head. At first, there was no sign of Patti. A search party formed, but it wasn't until the following day when Patti was recovered, located 7 miles from where Bogle was found and down a steep embankment. She was fully clothed and had also been shot in the back of the head. Robbery didn't seem to be a motive for the slayings, as Bogle's money and camera were found in the vehicle. Officers said in the statement at the time, "We're grabbing at every straw we can find. We have a mad killer on the loose." Without a motive or suspect, the case went cold. Eventually, it became Great Falls' oldest cold case. There were several attempts to close the case. In 1989, a tree in the area where Bogle had been murdered was cut down because it contained a bullet, though it was determined to not be related to the case. The final hope in solving the case came down to DNA evidence recovered from Patti's body. Though it had been collected at a time long before law enforcement would ever have known of such a thing, the DNA evidence was sent off to Bogle Labs in 2019. The sample yielded a genetic profile, and from there it was uploaded to several voluntary genealogy databases. From there, genealogists were able to piece a family tree, starting from distant cousins and finally narrowing it down to a suspect. Kenneth Gold had died in 2007, but a DNA sample was offered to law enforcement from his daughter. They determined that Gold was the likely perpetrator of the murders. Gold had never been a suspect, and he had no criminal history. His daughter was shocked by the revelation. We will never know why he murdered the young couple, but he would have been about 29 at the time of the slayings. A month after the murders, Gold had sold his property and moved out of Montana. He had lived a block from Patti's home and had worked corralling horses even closer. Perhaps he was jealous, or had been stalking Patti.
Investigators poured their heart and soul into this case. I mean, they leave a little bit of themselves from what I've seen.
For nearly a decade, Sergeant John Cadner has been one of those investigators. At a press conference Tuesday, he announced that through the use of DNA technology, a 65-year-old cold case had been closed. In 1956, 16-year-old Patti Kalitzke of Great Falls was raped and murdered. Her boyfriend, 18-year-old Malmstrom Airman Duane Bogle, was also killed. Detectives looked at 35 suspects, including crime boss James Whitey Bulger, who had been in the area and arrested for rape in 1951. Another suspect was Edward Wayne Edwards, the subject of a book by former Great Falls Police Detective John Cameron, who was linked to Lover's Lane murders in Ohio and Wisconsin. Eventually, the science pointed to Kenneth Gould, who lived a mile from Kalitzke and corralled horses just blocks from her residence on the city's southwest side. While Cadner closed the case, there were others who played a role, like Phil Madison, a supervising detective who worked on it for 6 years.
And did a review of all the stuff that was there, evidence and the case file, and decided to send some of the evidence materials in to the state crime lab for a review with the newer technology. And that's where we identified that there was some DNA.
For all the detectives who contributed, they were just doing their job.
Quite frankly, that's our duty. Our duty is to make sure that we solve these cases, solve them the best we can.
You put the right investigator on it and they keep working the case, they could ultimately solve it.
Really glad to see this one put to bed.
In Great Falls, Tim McGonigal, MTN News.
It was January 27, 1996, when 17-year-old Gladys Arellano went missing from her home in Boyle Heights, Los Angeles, California. Gladys's family reported her missing the following day, and a search of the area was undertaken. 3 days later, on January 30th, a body was reported. It was the missing teen, partially clad, at the bottom of a ravine. Located 34 miles from downtown LA, she was found in a remote area of Topanga Canyon Road. She had been assaulted and strangled to death. A DNA sample was collected from Gladys's body, which generated a profile that detectives were able to input into the California state databases. Officers were hopeful that they would find a match quickly, but the case went cold for nearly 25 years. Finally, detectives got a hit they were waiting for, a positive match. In November 2019, Jose Luis Garcia was arrested for domestic assault. As per California laws, Garcia was required to submit a DNA sample to the state. Officers gathered a warrant to obtain another sample to directly compare to the sample from the crime scene. It was then the officers learned that after Garcia had been released in November, he immediately moved to Dallas, Texas. Garcia was picked up by Texas federal law enforcement. He was questioned about the 1996 slaying at his home, but claimed he had no knowledge of Gladys. His DNA was taken while in Texas, and it was determined to be a direct match. He was then arrested and extradited back to California. In 1996, Garcia had been a year older than Gladys, now 43. The then 18-year-old had lived near Gladys. At the time, there is no additional information as to motive of the slaying. Gladys's older sister and niece spoke at a press conference and thanked detectives.
My name is Samantha Moreno. Gladys was my aunt and goddaughter. On behalf of the Arellano family, we would like to thank the Sheriff's Homicide Bureau for their diligent work on arresting Jose Luis Garcia. Thank you for not giving up on our Gladys, who was a loving daughter, sister, aunt, and godmother. Thank you, Detective Purcell, Detective Davis, and Lori for taking Gladys's case and not giving up. Gladys was only 17 when she was murdered. She had a beautiful soul. She was beautiful, intelligent, gorgeous, and had a radiant smile. She had such big dreams for her life. My grandparents would have been so proud of her. It was extremely painful for all of us to lose her and live through 24 and a half years of not knowing who killed her. We are pleased to know that Jose Luis Garcia has been taken off the streets after 24 and a half years. We want nothing more than for him to pay for his brutal crime. We recognize that this will not bring Gladys back, but we are relieved to know that there will be justice for Gladys Arellano, who would have celebrated her 42nd birthday on Saturday, October 24th. This is a victory that we acknowledge in her honor, and we look forward to more victories. We would like to thank all the media outlets that covered Gladys's tragic story in 1996 and are covering it now. Recognizing her life is important. Beautiful Latina souls from Boyle Heights should never be forgotten. Acts of violence against women should never be forgotten. Thank you to all the law enforcement agencies that collaborated on Gladys's case and made the arrest of Jose Luis Garcia possible. Lastly, to all the families that are out there who are living through unsolved cases like we were, there is hope, and we pray for you and your loved ones. We pray that the system will bring these criminals to justice. Those who take beautiful souls away from us need to own up to and pay for their crimes. Thank you.
The detectives in this particular case were part of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department Homicide Bureau Unsolved Case Unit, comprised of 12 retired homicide detectives. They work on cold cases on a part-time basis, and the LA County alone has over 15,000 unsolved cold cases. Jose Luis Garcia January 15th, 1980 was a cold, dark winter's evening. Barbara Mae Tucker was a business undergrad at the Mount Hood Community College in Gresham, Oregon. Barb was the youngest of 7 siblings. She played on her high school basketball team, where her 5'11" frame was an asset for the team. The 19-year-old was heading into campus to attend an evening class. She told her mother earlier that day she had hoped that class would be dismissed early so that she could visit a friend and have ice cream. However, Barbara never made it to class or to that friend's house later that evening. It was very odd, as it was unlike Barbara to miss a class. No one heard from her for the rest of the evening. The following morning, a student was cutting through a wooded area on the way to campus and made a grisly discovery. Barbara's body was discovered. She had been rolled into a patch of bushes, and she had been savagely beaten and sexually assaulted. The violent crime shocked the community, but during the investigation, it was discovered that there had likely been several witnesses to the attack.
Witnesses say she was running onto Northeast Kane from the woods on the west side of the Mount Hood Community College campus, where she went to school. Witnesses remember seeing her either waving at somebody or trying to get people's attention, but nobody stopped. Another witness saw a man come out of those same woods and lead Barbara back to campus.
Several vehicles saw Barbara run out of the wooded area and attempt to flag people down, but no one stopped. Others said that they saw a man follow her out of the bushes and grab her, but again, no one intervened. Some were saying they thought it was a college prank or something like that, but it wasn't. No one could identify the man that had been seen with Barbara. It had been dark, and there had been nothing that stood out to witnesses. Without a description, there was little hope of finding a suspect. Barbara's case went cold for 4 decades.
Deceased victims, murder victims, need a voice.
Turnage says evidence from the crime scene, coupled with modern advances in DNA technology and DNA ancestry databases, along with research and analysis by Parabon Nanolabs, led to a DNA profile match.
In 2015, a detective was assigned to the cold case, and he promised to get justice for Barbara. A DNA sample from the original investigation was sent off to Parabon Nanolabs, and it took several years to narrow in on a suspect using reverse family engineering technology, but they were able to locate a suspect. 58-year-old Robert Plimpton. He would have been 16 at the time of the crime, and he was arrested during a traffic stop. After his arrest, it was discovered that Plimpton had a history of violence towards women. In 1997, a woman had accused him of driving to a secluded area and attacking her, but she managed to escape alive. Though he had been arrested, his charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence. Plimpton was charged with first-degree murder and second-degree murder and sexual assault. He may have other victims out there, and his DNA is being tested in other cold cases in the area. He has pled not guilty, and there will be a trial later this year. On May 15, 1988, 8-year-old Joshua Harmon was playing in the woods behind his apartment complex in Roswell, Georgia. He was still exploring the area. The family had only moved in 3 weeks ago. It was a warm evening, and many children were playing in the area. Joshua loved nature, and his favorite place to play was in the woods. Joshua was expected to come home for supper, and when he failed to show up, his mother looked for him, calling out his name in the neighborhood. Joshua had a learning disability, and he was easily frightened and wasn't comfortable around strangers. He never stayed too far from home, and certainly never out of earshot. His mother called the Roswell police to report him missing, and though they responded quickly, it wasn't initially thought to be concerning. While canvassing, they discovered Joshua had last been seen around 7 p.m. He had gone to a neighbor's house and asked if a little boy could come play, but the family was having supper, so the boy wasn't allowed out. Joshua told him that he would be playing out in the woods if he wanted to join him after supper, and that was the last encounter anyone had with the child. As night crept closer, the search began to take a more concerned tone. Officers even searched the area between his old house and the new apartment in case he might have gotten confused or lost, but there was no sign of the child. The search continued for 48 hours. Officers combed the 60-acre forest in the surrounding area. On May 17th, an officer entering the scene tripped and saw Joshua's body under a log, with dirt and pine straw hiding him from view. Joshua had been struck over the head and strangled to death. Despite an extensive investigation, the case went cold. His mother, Sherry, spent decades keeping Joshua's investigation alive. Sherry passed in October of 2020. In February 2021, cold case detectives had decided to reopen the investigation and decided to start from scratch. With the permission of the family, Joshua was exhumed and forensic experts were able to recover DNA evidence. The sample was input into the national database and they got a hit from a previously convicted felon, and on July 21, 2021, they made an arrest. Known child predator 56-year-old James Coates was arrested while taking an Uber.
The Roswell Police Department has made an arrest in the 1988 murder of 8-year-old Joshua Harmon. James Michael Coates, age 56, of the city of Woodstock, was taken into custody July 21st and booked into the Fulton County Jail on multiple charges including murder. Roswell detectives arrested Coates after DNA evidence collected from the crime scene linked him to the murder.
Coates had previously already served a 20-year sentence for a separate incident in 1993. In 1988, Coates was living in the same housing complex in Roswell, but was never considered a suspect until now. Coates will remain in custody until his trial. Roswell PD is working to determine if there are any additional victims. Joshua's family said the arrest is bittersweet, but thanked officers for the dedication to solve Joshua's murder.
I am Sherry Harmon's sister and Joshua's aunt. I want to speak on behalf of our family and thank these amazing people who have worked diligently and very hard and always took anything and everything we had to say to heart and ran with it. And these bulldogs that got through everything and worked for 33 years to solve this for our family, we are forever indebted to all of you. You're amazing people. It's bittersweet for us. We wish Sherry could be here, but we also feel that she and Josh high-fived and said, we're gonna help and we're gonna get everybody through this, and helped these ladies and gentlemen come to this conclusion.
On June 1, 1989, in Las Vegas, Nevada, 14-year-old Stephanie Isaacson was getting ready for school. It was almost summer break, and the teen was excited about summer. She said goodbye to her dad and left the house at 6:30 a.m. Stephanie used the same route every day, cutting through a sandlot shortcut to get to El Dorado High School. All seemed normal throughout the day until her father came home from work and noticed Stephanie wasn't home. It wasn't that late yet, so he decided to call the school and see if Stephanie had been held up or been asked to stay late. It was then that the school informed him that Stephanie hadn't arrived for classes that day. He then called several of Stephanie's friends. All of them said that they hadn't seen her that day and didn't know where she was. Police were called and an aggressive investigation began right away.
At that point, the father contacted all of her friends, and none of them had seen her at school that day. Shortly afterwards, he called the LVMPD to file a missing persons report. At that time, Metro Police began an exhaustive air and ground search, attempting to locate Stephanie.
A search party went out, retracing Stephanie's walk to school. Her books and backpack were found first. It was discovered that Stephanie hadn't made it far from home. While searching the empty sandlot near her house, Stephanie's body was discovered. She had been sexually assaulted, bludgeoned, and strangled. It was a devastating loss in the community, and despite best efforts from officers, a suspect was never identified. It had been the early morning when she was walking to school, and officers suspected that her attacker had studied her routine and waited for her in the secluded sandlot. No one saw anything or anyone suspicious. Despite best efforts from detectives, the case went cold. Over the years, the case would be reopened and evaluated. There was a DNA sample recovered from the crime scene, and over the years, it had been checked and rechecked with no match. Over time, there was only one more opportunity for DNA testing. A local man came forward. He wanted to pay for one case to be sent off to Ortham Labs. He had seen the success from reverse genetic genealogy family trees being created to solve crimes, and he wanted to help. Any cold case at the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, he would fund the lab costs. The first case that came to mind for the LVMPD was Stephanie's cold case. They sent Ortham 15 cells for genome sequencing, and as we have seen in so many cases, they were able to match with distant relatives sourced from public databases, and from there they were able to piece together a family tree. They were able to find a distant cousin to their suspect, and after 32 years, they were able to make an identification. Las Vegas resident Darren Roy Marchand had lived nearby at the time of Stephanie's murder, and detectives believes it was likely a random attack. He had previously been arrested in connection to the 1986 murder of 24-year-old Nanette Vanderberg. She had been murdered in her home, and though they had an eyewitness placing Marchand near the area, there was no evidence to connect him as DNA testing wasn't available at the time, and he was released and the case was dismissed. With the positive identification of Marchand in Stephanie's case, they were able to test samples from both cases and were able to determine Marchand had killed both Stephanie and Nanette. Marchand committed suicide in 1995 at age 29. He would have been 20 when he killed Nanette and 23 when he killed Stephanie. Stephanie's mother said in a statement that she was glad to finally know who had killed her daughter, but was disappointed that there would be no justice in her murder. She said that she never believed that the case would be solved. The LMVPD said in a statement that anyone interested in making a similar donation to help solve a cold case is welcome to at www.lvmpdfoundation.org and designate the donation to Homicide Cold Case.
I'm glad they found who murdered my daughter. I never believed the case would be solved. It's good to have some closure, but there is no justice for Stephanie at all. We will never have complete closure because nothing will ever bring my daughter back to us. This 32-year-old homicide was solved because of the forensic work and genealogy work. Due to the limited amount of DNA that was available, that was just spoken about, the chances of this case ever being solved without this new technology was very, very slim. The LVMPD would like to thank Othram Laboratory for their hard work on this very difficult case, but the biggest thank you goes to the generous donor, who is Justin Wu, W-O-O, who made all of this possible. Not only Stephanie's family and friends, but our community finally has closure for this horrible crime.
On the evening of September 27, 1974, 15-year-old Lori Nesson was one of many students cheering in the crowds at a high school football game in Columbus, Ohio. After the game, Lori, an Eastmore High School honors student, joined her classmates at several parties. She was last seen leaving a party at 12:30 a.m., but never made it home. On September 28th, her body was found on Rose Hill Road in Reynoldsburg, Ohio. She was left naked in a ditch with her clothes scattered along the road for several miles. Lori's death was not initially classified as a homicide. Instead, the coroner described it as death by asphyxiation from an unknown means. Over the years, her case would be reviewed twice more, once in 1998 and again in 2007, to no avail. With the lack of evidence and a shortage of DNA testing capabilities, the case went cold and remained that way for decades. It wasn't until 2019 that the case was reopened.
So Lori Nesson was a 15-year-old girl that was found naked on the side of the road, and they didn't know what happened to her, and this was 46 years ago. So over the years, there's been multiple attempts at trying to elucidate who a suspect could have been and what evidence might have been available. And ultimately, it was the tenacity of the Reynoldsburg Police Department to pursue this case and keep trying to find an answer that led us to where we are today. So the case was originally not classified as a homicide. The coroner had called it death by asphyxiation from an unknown means. So just recently, they were able to, with Reynoldsburg's persistence, they were able to get it turned over to a homicide. There were a lot of challenges just because the evidence collection and preservation back in that time period was much different than it is today because they didn't know about DNA. So once we got the evidence, we realized that it had been packaged in plastic, which is not good for DNA. And then we also were concerned about the age of the of the evidence. But we went ahead and moved forward with testing anyway, and due to advanced technologies in the field, as well as just the persistence of the law enforcement agency to get an answer, we were able to develop a profile from the genes and compare it to some suspects that they had developed, and we made an inclusion. So pretty exciting. So what was really cool about this case is that as this testing was in progress, the detective at Reynoldsburg Police Department had contacted me and told me that he had been having discussions with other area law enforcement to determine if there were any potential cases that were similar to his. Since it was a pretty, horrific crime, it had some unique details. There are always issues with preservation of evidence over time, just that the agency's not understanding back then what they had and the potential for it to be used as evidence. So when I still remember opening that data set and looking at it and just being like, oh my gosh, this actually gave us something. It's a 46-year-old piece of evidence, and we were able to, with the perseverance of the law enforcement agency and the advancement in our technology, able to actually get a profile. So it was definitely something that we all hope for in working these cases, is to get an answer and be able to provide closure for the family. So it was really cool.
Reynoldsburg Patrol Officer Craig Bradford solicited the coroner's office to reopen and review the case based on a hunch he had. He then went through the files and found many inconsistencies that suggested Lori's death had involved foul play. In September of 2020, Officer Bradford presented the evidence to the Franklin County Coroner's Office, and Lori Nesson's death was officially ruled a homicide. Lori's family had suspected foul play from the beginning. "Somebody knows something," said Lori's sister, Toni Hastings, who was 13 at the time of her murder. A 92-pound, 15-year-old girl does not lay down on the side of the road naked and die on her own. But that wasn't the end of the road for this case. In December of 2020, a local news station in Ohio shared an article updating Lori's case with the homicide ruling, and then the police got a tip that would change everything. Right after the segment aired, Police Sergeant Jim Koslow received a phone call from a cousin of the late Karen Adams, whose story was sadly very similar to Lori Nesson's. 17-year-old Karen Adams had been murdered 6 months after Lori on March 9, 1975. She had disappeared while walking to a friend's home. The next day, Karen's body was discovered in a ditch in Blacklick, Ohio, less than 4 miles from Reynoldsburg. Like Lori, Karen's murder was left unsolved for decades. Sergeant Koslow reached out to the investigator who helped solve Karen's case in 2011 using advanced forensic technology, which identified Karen's killer as Robert Mayer and Charles Weber. By the time Karen's murderers were identified, one of them, Charles Weber, had already died. Robert Mayer, on the other hand, was now 70 years old. He was arrested and sentenced to 15 years in prison for the murder of Karen Adams and died while incarcerated. Although they couldn't get a DNA swab from Charles Weber, his son offered a cheek swab to provide familial DNA that could confirm Charles was involved in Karen's murder. Detective Chuck Clark from the Franklin County Sheriff's Office told Sergeant Koslow he believed that these were likely the same 2 men who were responsible for Lori's murder. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation was then able to confirm Weber and Mayer were the same men responsible for Lori Nesson's death. Both men had a violent criminal history, including murder, robbery, rape, and kidnapping. In 2021, Lori's family and friends gathered for a memorial to honor her life, which Gene Adams, brother of Karen Adams, also attended. Beforehand, Lori's sister Toni visited Lori's grave to tell her of her killer's identification and let her know that justice had been served.
Lori, these are the pictures of the men who assaulted and murdered you. These were the people that took your life, and they are both dead.
I really hope that this opens the doors for other cases, for other families that have no answers, Toni Hastings said in a statement to media. Nobody should ever have to wait 46 years. It was the day before Thanksgiving weekend, November 26, 1980, in Irvine, California. While many people were preparing for the weekend's festivities, the 42-year-old mother of four, Judith, who went by Judy Nesbitt, was going to the Marina Dunes yacht anchorage in Newport Beach. The Nesbitt family had recently bought a home and decided to sell their boat, a 36-foot-long cabin cruiser called the Felicidad IV. According to Judy's son, she received a phone call at 9:30 that morning from a prospective buyer who booked a 1 p.m. appointment to see the yacht. Judy obliged and left to meet the potential buyer, but then hours passed by without a word from her. By 7 p.m., her husband Fred was worried and decided to head down to the marina to check on her. Upon entering the cabin of the boat, he discovered the body of his wife. Scene investigators found signs of a violent struggle, which they suggested culminated in Judy's death. She had been shot once in the head. While the boat had not been ransacked, cash, credit cards, and a checkbook were missing from Judy's purse, pointing police towards robbery as a motive. Hairs from an unknown person were extracted from the crime scene and kept as evidence, but since this was 1980, DNA testing had yet to come into the picture. Even though the Marina Dunes yacht anchorage was identified as private property, there were no security gates or security personnel on site. A fellow boater's cruiser had been stolen several days prior to the murder, but it was soon recovered by harbor police. After talking with local boaters and witnesses, police put together a description of a man who was seen inspecting the boat on the day of the murder. The man was described as 30 to 35, medium weight, and between 5'7" and 5'10". He had brown hair and aviator glasses. According to a Los Angeles Times article, witnesses also saw a man leaving the boat after they heard screams and a gunshot. This information was not immediately reported to police. Newport Beach police worked over the holiday weekend in an effort to solve the case, but aside from the suspect description, they had few clues to go off of, and so the case went cold. In 2002, investigators were able to build out a limited DNA profile based on the roots of the hairs found at the crime scene. The profile was entered into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, which analogs DNA information gathered and used by law enforcement agencies, but unfortunately they couldn't find a match within the database. Years passed, and although the police department never gave up on their search for Judy's killer, they had no further leads. Then in 2018, there was a break in the case. Green Laboratories, an independent testing lab, was able to produce a more detailed DNA profile extracted from the remaining hair shafts found at the crime scene. And on Monday, August 9, 2021, the Newport Beach Police Department announced they finally had identified Judy Nesbitt's killer. Through the use of investigative genetic genealogy, new forensic crime-solving techniques, and the assistance of the genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, the Newport Police Department identified Kenneth Elwyn Marks as Judy Nesbitt's killer. The police determined that Marks had been the one to make the 1 p.m. appointment under the guise of being a potential buyer for the yacht. He then followed Judy into the sleeping quarters of the cabin where he accosted her. A violent struggle broke out before he murdered her, stole the cash, credit cards, and checkbooks, and fled the scene. Marks was not considered a suspect during the investigation and is not known to be connected to any other crimes. He passed away from cancer in California in 1999, though officers are still looking to see if he may be connected to other cold cases. This was a landmark case as it included the first DNA extraction of its kind to identify a murderer during a criminal investigation in the United States. In a statement, Newport Beach Police Chief John T. Lewis said, "Kenneth Marks has passed away, but he no longer gets to hold the secrets of his deeds. Through incredible advances in technology and the tireless dedication of these investigators, we now have some closure for all who knew and loved Judy Nesbitt." On the evening of October 12, 1985, 28-year-old Denise Stafford was home alone with her daughter in Sarasota, Florida. Denise was a new mom, and her husband Frank was working a night shift at a local bar called the Playground Lounge. While the exact timeline of the events is unknown, sometime between 11 p.m. that night and 3:10 the next morning, Denise was attacked and strangled to death while standing in her bedroom. Her body was found with her head placed at the foot of the bed, leading investigators to believe that she had been placed there after her murder. Police reviewed the crime scene as well as the Stafford's home and found no evidence of forced entry. This led them to believe that Denise knew her killer and that they had been let into her house. But they weren't able to produce a suspect, leaving the case to go unsolved for 20 years. By 2020, DNA and forensic technologies had advanced rapidly. Investigators remained convinced that Denise had been placed on her bed by her killer and that her clothing would contain traces of the killer's DNA from where they had to have touched her to move her. So in March of 2020, the clothes that Denise was wearing at the time of her murder were sent to be re-examined, and they found something. Foreign DNA had been discovered underneath the knees and around the ankles of the pants Denise had been wearing at the time of the murder, confirming the investigators' theory. Then in August of 2021, 35 years after Denise's murder, the Sarasota Police Department announced they had found her killer. The foreign DNA found on her pants belonged to convicted killer Joseph Megaletti. So who was Joseph Megaletti? Megaletti was a co-worker of Denise's husband, Frank, at the Playground Lounge. Over time, Megaletti had come to know Frank's work schedule and had met Denise and had visited them at their home. Denise had also received seat covers for her car from Megaletti. While he was considered a person of interest in the case at the time, along with a few other people, he was never officially developed as a suspect. Megaletti died in prison in 2015 at the age of 64 while serving a life sentence for the 1995 murder of former neighbor Kathleen Leonard. He had been arrested in 1999 and had been convicted in June 2001. Much like Denise's murder, there had been no sign of forced entry at Kathleen's home, and she too had been found lying on her bed. So why did Megaletti kill Denise Stafford? Civilian investigator Jeff Birdwell said while there's no clear motive, Megaletti was a known drug user and had a record of committing crimes to support his drug use. Maybe the motive was robbery. Maybe he knew the family had something, an item that he could utilize. I don't know the motive that brought him into their house in October of 1985. I just know the results.
Maybe the motive was robbery. Maybe he knew the family had something, an item that he could utilize. I don't know. I don't know the motive that brought him to their house on October of 1985. I just know the results.
While no official motive may ever be known, Denise Stafford's case was officially closed thanks to the decades-long work of the Sarasota Police Department and the many advances in forensic technology. Denise's mother, Dorla Nipper, described her daughter as a loving person who is missed by the entire family. She says, finding that Mr. Megaletti was the perpetrator and that he's gone, that he's not going to harm anyone else, that has been my healing cry from the beginning. I didn't want to see another mother go through what our family has.
Finding that Mr. Megaletti was the perpetrator and that he's gone, he's not going to harm anyone else. That has been my hue and cry from the beginning. I didn't want to see any other mother go through what our family has.
Investigator Birdwell issued a warning to criminals who think they've gotten away with their crimes, saying, "It's important for every suspect out there who hasn't been arrested to understand you haven't gotten away with it. We're still coming. You still need to look over your shoulder. With some effort on our part and with technology, your day is coming."
It's important for every suspect out there who hasn't been arrested to understand you haven't gotten away with it. We're still coming. You still need to look over your shoulder, and with some effort on our part and with technology, your day's coming.
In 1991, Patricia Moreno, or Tricia as her friends and family knew her, was 17 years old, living with her foster family in Malden, Massachusetts. By June, she had been living with her foster mother and 2 foster sisters at their Henry Street apartment for just over 2 months. Then, just after 3 a.m. on June 20th, police responded to a disturbing call from Patricia's foster mother. They arrived at the apartment building and went up to the family's 3rd floor unit. There, they found Patricia on the fire escape, suffering from a gunshot wound to the head. She was found alone, face down on the 3rd floor fire escape landing, still breathing but seriously injured in the middle of the night. Though she was rushed to the Massachusetts General Hospital immediately, She died approximately 12 hours later. When police spoke with the family, they determined that Patricia's foster mother, her 2 teenage daughters, and Rodney Daniels, the boyfriend of one of the daughters, were all home when the murder occurred. They all said they heard 2 gunshots, but none of them knew who pulled the trigger. Daniels, who was 18 at the time, stayed at the apartment occasionally. When speaking to the police, he claimed he was asleep in the living room when he heard the gunshots and ran out to the fire escape where he found Patricia. During their investigation, police determined the crime scene had found no signs of forced entry and no weapons or shell casings. They did, however, discover that Daniels owned multiple handguns. They also found out that in the months leading up to Patricia's murder, she and Daniels had several unpleasant interactions, which included Daniels threatening her. Still, no arrests were made. Years passed without Patricia's family and friends receiving any closure. Then, in 2019, Middlesex County District Attorney Marion Ryan created a new cold case unit. In 2020, the unit was assigned to Patricia's case. Investigators reconstructed the scene at the apartment, where they determined that based on Patricia's location, the shot had been fired from the doorway to the apartment. They started re-interviewing witnesses, too, which included a resident of the building who lived above the family, but had previously been out of the country. According to the witness, they'd been woken up by a loud noise and looked to the fire escape, where they saw a man matching Daniels' appearance. With that information, the police obtained a warrant for Daniels and arrested him without incident on September 27, 2021. Daniels, now 48, living in Georgia, was indicted and arraigned on first-degree charges for the murder of Patricia Moreno. That same month, Middlesex District Attorney Marion Ryan and Chief Calvin Molis of the Malden Police Department announced that Patricia's killer had been identified and charged. In a joint statement, they said,
"We know that whenever we make these kind of announcements, it is bittersweet. Because on the one hand, we are finally able to hold someone accountable. On the other hand, as was the case yesterday in talking to Tricia's loved ones, it certainly brings back a well of memories, takes people back to probably what was one of the worst incidents in their lives."
Daniels' arrest was the first made by the Middlesex DA's cold case unit. The police emphasized that the arrest was not due to new forensic technology like so many other cases, but due to the department's traditional police work and persistence. Malden Chief Kevin Molis spoke about the success of the cold case arrest and had warnings for those who assumed they've gotten away with the crime.
If there's somebody out there who has committed crimes, let the message be told, we don't forget.
In the summer of 1977, Ileana, 16, and Eric Sean Goldstern, 17, were enjoying their summer break as a couple before they returned to school at North Eugene High School in Eugene, Oregon. On Monday, June 9th, they were headed to the Broken Bowl picnic grounds in the Fall Creek area of the Lane County, where they planned to spend the afternoon fishing and picnicking. But when neither teen returned home, their parents began to worry. They then called the Lane County Sheriff's Office, which sent an officer out to check on them. The officer discovered Liana's body first, near the picnic area. She had been sexually assaulted and shot to death. They then found Eric's body, which was in a nearby bush. He too had been shot to death. Though police gathered fingerprints and DNA from the scene, they found no matches. But that didn't stop them from continuing their investigation into the double murder. Over the years, investigators conducted many interviews and polygraph tests. They analyzed and reanalyzed the evidence and tested different firearms and bullets to try and find a match. Still, they could never establish a solid lead on who killed Ileana and Eric. 43 years later, in June of 2020, the case was cracked wide open. The suspect's DNA from the crime scene was resubmitted and analyzed using new genealogical technologies, and they had an ID, Ronald Albert Troy. At the time of the murders, Troy was 23 years old and a resident of Lane County, Oregon. He had moved from the area 3 years after the murders and had been living in Arizona since 2008. Little is known about Troy, and he seems to have kept a low profile. In February of 2021, investigators were prepared to present their findings to a grand jury before arresting and charging Troy, but they never got the chance. He took his own life after an unrelated domestic violence incident in Arizona. Ileana and Herok are remembered fondly. In their high school yearbook, they're described as two good-natured and fun-loving members of the student body, and outgoing personalities who were better than average students. Though their killer couldn't be brought to justice, hopefully his identification provided some closure for their families.
There's no describing Judy other than wow. She was just wow in everything she did.
On July 28, 1988, Judy was found in the basement of her former Fargo building on D Street in Boston, Massachusetts. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled by her killer, who wouldn't be identified for 33 years. The journey to identifying Judy's murder began in 1990. Richard Vega, who also went by Carl Vega, Ricardo Vega, and Ricardo Mazzarino, had been convicted in 1990 of 3 counts of rape and sentenced to 20 years in prison. As part of his conviction, Vega was required to submit a DNA sample to the FBI's Combined DNA Indexing System, also known as CODIS, but since there were limited DNA testing capabilities during that time, he couldn't be connected to Judy's murder just yet. In 2008, Vega was set to be released from prison, but after a petition from the Suffolk County prosecutors, a jury found him too sexually dangerous to live in the public, and he was civilly committed, where he remains today. A few years later, in 2011, Suffolk County prosecutors and Boston Police Department's homicide unit detectives identified Vega as a suspect in Judy's murder after CODIS matched his DNA profile to the DNA found at the crime scene. They still couldn't charge Vega. The DNA match wasn't sufficient enough evidence, and they couldn't prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Then District Attorney Rachel Rollins' Project for Unsolved Suffolk Homicides, PUSH, stepped in. They re-examined the case and collected enough additional evidence that they were able to present to a grand jury and charge Vega with Judy's murder on August 30th, 2021. Miss Chamberlain's life mattered, and there will be a lifetime of accountability for her brutal murder and callous disposal. Judy's family and loved ones never stopped loving her, and we never stopped searching for answers. It has been a long road, and we are so grateful for the excellent police and investigative work that got us to this moment. In an interview, Judy's sister said she was shocked when she heard news of the arrest.
I was floored. It's like it just took back a lot of old memories.
Judy's brother, John Olson, said he had actually given up hope on the case.
I did give up hope. I never thought this day would ever come. After 33 years, justice has finally been brought for my sister and my family.
With so many cold cases being solved this year, let it be a warning to those who have perpetuated crimes. Your time is up, and don't think you've gotten away with it. Well, that is it for this video. As always, please give this video a thumbs up if you like the content, and subscribe for more if you haven't already. If you've done all that and want to support me and the channel, we have channel membership as well as Patreon to get early access, members-only content, live streams, and more. We also have merch and other goodies in the description box, as well as links to all my socials. But until then, I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.